Um, I might share my screen if that's okay with everybody. So as Matthew has said, my name is SD Marku, and I'm the director of the Modern Slavery Unit here at the University of Sydney. And we'll talk a little bit about our team and the colleagues that are joining us today in a moment. But before we get into that, just a quick overview of our agenda. We hope to spend a few minutes with you talking about how we framed our approach to addressing modern slavery, which was really quite critical in the type of work that we did as a result, what we did, what we learned, and some risks and opportunities for the sector as a whole, and perhaps some options for us to work with you and collaborate on how we can address modern slavery together and hopefully end it once and for all. As I mentioned today, I'm joined by colleagues across not only the Modern Slavery Unit, but also our project partner areas. So Phil Chan is joining us today from our procurement service area. Claire, who is our head of policy and stakeholder engagement, is also online with us. And we have two other staff members that work with us that are currently offline, probably enjoying a lovely dinner somewhere, at least I hope. Now, before we get into any of the content that we want to cover today, I do want to stop and acknowledge that the University of Sydney and its campuses sits on the ancestral land of many of Australia's first people, who for thousands of generations have shared knowledge for the benefit of all. We pay our respect and acknowledge the elders and community of these lands, past, present, and emerging. And I think it would be amiss of me to not also recognise and acknowledge at this point that First Nations people survival of policies and practices that today we call modern slavery, including forced labour, servitude, sexual servitude, and the worst forms of child labour and forced marriage. And these are horrible crimes and a very dark past here in Australia, but one that we as a university have engaged with and are starting to consider in a more meaningful way and as part of this work as well. Just a little bit about the University of Sydney. In case you don't know too much about us, we are Australia's oldest university, founded in 1850, which to many of you might sound like very new. And compared to some of Europe's universities, we're probably considered toddler age. But for us, that seems very old. We have a very large student body with over 70,000 students. A pretty big employee staff cohort as well, with 26,000 staff, and that includes casuals, affiliates, and fixed term. We offer 900,000 award courses. We have 5,000 plus suppliers, and we have alumni in over 170 countries around the world. So we're very proud of that, and we take our responsibility as being Australia's biggest and first university very seriously. Which brings me to the next slide around the Modern Slavery Unit and its strategic objective and why it was set up. And we'll spend a few minutes talking about how this came to be, which is an interesting story in and of itself, actually. But the Modern Slavery Unit is a small team set up in the Office of the Provost to do two things. One is to ensure that the university adopts best business and human rights practice, due diligence practice. And a lot of that is driven by modern slavery legal compliance obligations that we have here in Australia, both at the Commonwealth level and also at the state level. We have two pieces of legislation that we have to comply with in varying degrees. The second really is focused on accelerating education and research excellence in business and human rights. And we see this as critically important as it really goes to the moral heart of what it means to be an education institution. We want our education and research to really contribute to the global good. And the best way for us to do that is by incorporating content around this issue through our education and research. And there's been some amazing work already done by the University of Sydney in this space, including launching the world's first financial human rights benchmark by Professor David Kinley in our School of Law and Dr. Kim Sheehan. We're also working on very exciting modern slavery footprinting methodology with our School of Physics. And we've also launched the first shared value and responsible business unit of study in our MBA program earlier last year. I'm very proud to say that the university's efforts so far have been considered sector leading, and Sydney has been ranked #1 in Australia in the higher education sector for its response to modern slavery. Now, I must disclose that performance overall was very low. So it's not so much that we were doing particularly well, which we are, but it's also that other universities have not taken a strategic response to modern slavery, which is why the University of Sydney has been ranked so highly. And to me, it's really more of a common sense approach rather than a strategic approach, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, how we work is also critically important. And I mentioned our project partners. So we're a very small team in the Office of the Provost, but we work really closely with our delivery partners. Of course, that means colleagues in procurement, in research, in education, in our general council, in our university affiliated entities, such as our unions, residential colleges, controlled entities. We also work with civil society really, really closely. And that's been a really important part of informing how we design our frameworks and our policies. We also have a really close relationship with government, both at the state and the Commonwealth government. And Claire, who is on a call today, is one of our seconded resources to support the Anti-Slavery Commissioner here in New South Wales with his strategic plan. And really importantly, we also work really close with business. And it's interesting, just today, a couple of hours ago, we got a call from Westpac to help them with some training on responsible business and human rights due diligence. So working with business has given us an insight to what the market is calling for in terms of education and research that is still missing in this sector. And of course, our favourite collaborators really are within the education sector itself, both in Australia and abroad, and within higher education networks, including the Australian Procurement Network, which Phil Chan will speak about in a few moments. And of course, our friends at Edinburgh that have been our collaborators for almost 3 years now, in some form or another. But this approach, what we call is a collaborative network for collective impact model, has been incredibly beneficial in helping us fill the gaps, because it starts on the principle that we do not have all the information we possibly need, nor do we have the resources to solve the problem on our own. It's only through collaborative partnerships can we move the dial, and that's what we're interested in doing, is really having a meaningful impact on eliminating modern slavery. Now, just a quick recap on what modern slavery actually is. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, because I suspect that if you're on this call, you very much believe in the need to eradicate modern slavery and what modern slavery is. But just a little, just a little pause here to say that there are over 50 million people estimated to be in modern day slavery globally. And of course, these are just estimates. And as you can see via this map, a very large proportion of those are in the Asia Pacific, which is why for us here in Australia, this is such a close to home issue for us. We have such a huge engagement economically, politically with the Asia Pacific region, and understanding that that's where most of the risk lies is significant. But like every country in the world, Australia is not immune, and we know there is modern slavery in Australia. And in fact, we know that it exists on our very campuses. And we'll get to that in a minute when we start talking about the risks to students that we have unearthed that are particularly worrying. Now, in terms of the term modern slavery, and I wanted to pause on this, there is currently no agreed upon international definition of modern slavery. What unites these types of offences, criminal offences, is that there is an exercise of ownership over one person by another. And the term modern slavery in Australia really is an umbrella term to describe these criminal offences that are all crimes under the criminal code. But at the risk of sounding like Captain Obvious, a first port of call, I think, for all of us within the university sector is to come together and see if we can come up with an international definition of what we think modern slavery should include, and really to start putting together a standardized understanding of what it is and how to address it, which sounds like a higher education perfect research project if we have any PhD students on the call today. Now, why, and more importantly, how did the University of Sydney invest in a strategic response to addressing modern slavery, and why modern slavery compared to other sustainable development initiatives and goals? And I should reassure you by saying that the University of Sydney has invested and supports many initiatives and many sustainable development goals. We have a very healthy sustainability team, environmental sustainability of team of 10. We have a gender equity team. We have a team looking at Indigenous rights, and there are many other issues within the SDG agenda that we are proactively investing and resourcing. But the reason that modern slavery has become a strategic risk for the university is quite unique, and perhaps circumstantial as well. There is a strong business case strategic business case for us as a university, and this may relate to you as well in Europe, but for us here in Sydney, there were regulatory drivers that really informed the university's need to understand both its links to modern slavery, but also how it would position itself on this issue. Did it have a position, and what was that? So there were regulatory drivers that really informed that. And for us, that was the commencement of the Modern Slavery Act, which came into effect in 2018 at the Commonwealth level, at the federal level, and then the introduction of state-based legislation in the New South Wales government, which was tabled and billed and then taken off and reintroduced, and it has just officially commenced as of this year. But in addition to that, we also knew very early on that there were market drivers, what we call market drivers. And what we mean by that is that the growth of stakeholder capitalism, which is global citizenship is another term for it, this demand for organizations to prove their social license. In other words, the demand for large institutions to prove to the public or to their key stakeholders that they were interested in more than just benefiting themselves. And this has come through really, really strongly through a lot of surveys that we have seen. And this particular survey here, that's referenced on the left-hand side, it was the first of its kind by the Committee for Economic Development in Australia, where it surveyed over 3,000 people, and more than 70% of the general public said that organizations should place equal importance on economic, environmental, and social performance. Which was a really distinctive message. Equally distinctive was that millennials in particular, which is our key demographic being our students, really care about climate change, ethical supply chains, and these were the top two priorities in terms of what they wanted organizations to focus the energy on. And what's really perhaps most interestingly for us in terms of the drivers that really inform the strategic business case, is that for us, the University of Sydney, I don't know if you saw a few slides back, introduced a new campaign or perhaps a new strategy around leadership for good. And leadership for good starts here. This notion that as an institution of our nature, we should be advocating for the betterment of society, for contributing to the global good and the public good. And when this issue came up, it really tested the university's resolve on that. And addressing this issue was inherently and strategically linked to its leadership for good ambitions, and in particular, the expectations of its key stakeholders being its students. Now, I would love to say that these were the main drivers, and that I went to the university executive and made a very compelling moral case for why the university should invest and strategically address this issue. And whilst these factors were very much significant considerations, there was also an element of luck in our case. And that came in the form of a very big corporate scandal that broke 2 days before I was due to present to the University Executive Board. And this case was extremely, absolutely devastating. One of Australia's largest banks had just been sued by Australia's regulator for facilitating, or in other words, turning a blind eye to transactions over $11 billion that were linked to child exploitation through its downstream banking services in the Philippines and other parts of Asia. Now, this was extremely heartbreaking for everyone in Australia when such a large entity, Australia's got 4 big banks, this is one of them, acted with such impunity. And I think what was most heart-wrenching was that the executive actually knew about these issues for about 6 years. They were notified in 2016 and they did nothing about it. And the reason for that was because they didn't think it was their responsibility or strategic enough risk for them to really engage with this issue meaningfully. Now, within days of this news breaking, the CEO of this company resigned, the director of the chair of risk committee resigned, the chairman also brought forward his retirement and effectively resigned, and the board of directors were put on notice that they were being investigated by the regulation authority here in Australia, APRA. Westpac was then fined $1.5 billion, which is the biggest corporate fine in Australian corporate history. Now, this was breaking. It was all over the news. It was in every single news channel, newspaper. And 2 days before I went to present. So when I did actually go to present to the university executive, it was the most helpful of examples that demonstrated that actually not putting the risk to people first is a strategic risk. And ultimately what this case did was it really, I think, appealed to self-preservation motivations that often exist on executive boards. And I know I might sound particularly cynical when I say this, but the moral imperative in and of itself was not enough. We could have advocated for why the university should be doing this because it's the right thing, why students care about it, why, we have a moral imperative to demonstrate leadership for good. And all those were very strong, valid arguments. But ultimately, what seized the deal for us was actually pointing out to the executive that if the university turns a blind eye and it knows that these risks exist and it does nothing about it, it itself will be on the front page of the newspaper. And it was a really useful case study. We actually worked with our colleagues in the School of Law to do a case study for the executive on lessons learned from this case and what was led to these systematic failings of the board. And now, that was really a really great scene-setting conversation, because the next slide that I showed the executive was this slide, which I'm about to share with you, around the strategic risks. And these risks, I think, regardless of whether you're in Europe or in Australia, are really real. And they are not just periphery risks, but they're strategic, significant organizational-wide risks around reputation, the risk that university activities or operations and supply chains could be linked to severe human rights violations, child exploitation, forced labor. The risk that the revenue that the university relies on so heavily could be impacted because we have not done our due diligence, and suddenly government funding or funding from other sources dries up because we've not been able to meet the human rights due diligence requirements. And we've definitely seen this increase actually significantly in the last 3 years. But also legislative risks, because what the Westpac case showcased really eloquently was that for that child exploitation case to take place, multiple laws were breached in the process, and there was significant non-compliance, fraud, corruption, and weak governance that led to that case. So in fact, having really strong modern slavery due diligence ensures that you have really strong governance and really strong risk management, and that can prevent other risks from emerging as well. And of course, on the other side of the coin, there were also strategic opportunities that the university executive really were able to understand and quantify in their mind. And I should say, in full disclosure, that when we started out on this journey 3 years ago, in 2019, we did a benchmarking exercise. And in every single one of those, University of Sydney came last. We came last for our legal offerings in terms of the law school. We came last for the resource centres that we have. We don't have a human rights centre, resource centre, or a centre of excellence. We don't have the prominent professors other than a handful in human rights law or business and human rights practice. We were by far behind the 8 ball on every single one of those metrics. But what we did have was Australia's best business school. And we really wanted to utilise that competitive advantage and really use this opportunity to establish Sydney as the leader on business and human rights practice. So that is the application of business and human rights due diligence principles through the UNGPs or any other principles to our actual practice, and to do that in collaboration with our business partners, which we have significant amount of. So we really took something that was, I guess, a handicap, so to speak, and turned that into an opportunity, which is what we wanted to do. And this also gave us an opportunity to demonstrate relevance and value. And look, I don't know what the conversation is like in the UK at the moment, but for us in Australia, the conversation is very much along the lines of what is the relevant purpose of universities? There's other education forums out there. Are they really worth it? And for us, this was a really important discussion for us to be a part of. Just conscious of time, Matthew, so I might just move along a bit quicker here. Is that just checking how I'm going on time? We're doing okay?
Yeah, absolutely fine. No problem at all.
Okay, thank you very much. And just quickly as well here, the other thing that we learned, and we did a little bit of research on this actually, was that we knew that if the university could meaningfully take an authentic approach to this issue, we could attract ethically minded staff, students, donors, and really establish a new principle for how we partner with other organizations. So we could see this as strategically beneficial from so many angles. There was really no other way other than to take a university-wide approach. Any questions or comments before we move on to what we actually did from anyone? I'm going to save them to the end. Okay. Now, what did we actually do? Well, we started out with a really clear commitment. And you'll know here that there's not, in that commitment, we don't talk about modern slavery exclusively. We also mention a respect for human rights. And that was a really clear and distinctive decision that we made, because we wanted this to be broader than modern slavery. So we made a really clear commitment. This commitment was taken to our most senior board, our Senate, to approve, and along with our objective and our vision. And we set out to achieve 5 key things. And what we wanted to do was to be in a position where at any point in time, we can look at one of these 5 things and say, have we done that? And what are the KPIs to support that statement being made when we say we understand a modern slavery footprint? How do we do that? And do we really understand it? Where are the gaps? What are the things that we don't actually know about our footprint? And there's a lot that we're still learning along the way. But this kept us really honest, and it really gave us a sense of purpose and a sense of real sort of methodical roadmap that you really need, because you can get quite lost in terms of where you start and how you prioritize your actions. And speaking of prioritizing our actions, we borrowed from the great Stephen Covey of 7 Habits. I don't know if you have read the book, if anyone on this call is familiar with the book, but Stephen Covey introduces this principle of circle of concern versus circle of control. And we really looked at that, and we love that, because every conversation I was having with the executive was along the lines of, surely I can't be held accountable for how our research is being used. Surely I can't be held accountable for, I can't be expected to end modern slavery or to address global COVID pandemic related risks. And this was a really helpful way for us to do 3 things. One was to map our risks across our value chain. So really understanding where within this universe of concern our value chain really interacted with these risks. The second thing it helped us do was identify where within that circle of concern we actually have direct control. And when we mapped that, we realized we actually have a significant amount of levers and control available to us to address a lot of those risks. And that's really where we should start prioritizing our actions, which is why this is effectively a risk prioritization framework. It happens to be the most downloaded diagram on our website. So we have dedicated quite a lot of space to it on our website. So feel free to download it, and we have it available in Word and a case study that you can use if you want to use this for your own work. But what we learned when we did that was that this value chain approach identified 3 really significant risks, and supply chain was a significant one. And you have to consider and you start with supply chain if you really want to have meaningful impact. And we'll hear from Phil Chan in a moment about the great work that our procurement colleagues are doing in this space. But we found that 43%, and I think when we started that figure was 49, so it's gone down a little bit, but 43% of what we were purchasing and are purchasing is linked to modern slavery somewhere along the supply chain. Now, the other thing that we found during that process was that actually research and education and students were the two highest risk categories that we would have missed had we not taken that value chain approach. And research categories in particular, artificial intelligence, genome sequencing, of particular high risk, especially where those activities are taking place in collaboration with external parties. And we know that there's been instances that it's been linked to forced labor, and we'll talk about that in a research case study in a minute. The other key risk that I think shocked all of us and perhaps still sits somewhat uncomfortably with a lot of people when we speak about this issue is the risk to students, not just off campus, but on campus too. And this was, I think, still to this day, extremely heart-wrenching to believe that our students here at the University of Sydney and potentially on any campus around the world are at risk of experiencing debt bondage, forced marriage, forced labor. And just on Friday, we held a workshop with our student wellbeing officers, and we asked them for examples of where students have come to them. And it was harrowing to hear the stories of students being trafficked into Australia in situations of complete destitution and reaching out to the university because somebody's taken their money and they're now indebted to them and they're scared to go home. So these sort of risks are really heart-wrenching, but they are very unique to the university sector. And we've done quite a lot of work with civil society to support students, especially off campus, to access free resourcing and legal support. Now, we'll spend a few minutes just talking about each of these in a bit more detail. So I'll hand over to my colleague Phil, who will just talk us through our supply chain overview of our supply chain risks, and also an excellent collaboration that the University of Sydney is a part of that has been really instrumental in helping us identify and address modern slavery risks within the supply chain. Phil, I'll hand over to you at this point.
Thanks so much, Esty. And I'll also want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Gadigal land and to recognise the Aboriginal people. This is a custom that we have here in Australia. And to also give a shout out to Esty for her leadership, because she built this program from the ground up, and all the work and achievements that we're seeing is thanks to her leadership. So thank you so much, Esty. I'm based in procurement services, so I look after our work around modern slavery, ethical and sustainable supply chains. And you can see our modern slavery risk in our supply chains. And we've done kind of comprehensive mapping around where these risks are, honing in 6 high-risk categories to really drill down through due diligence and risk assessments. Now, I'll focus on the case study around our supply chain collaboration in the next slide. This is a really great exemplar of how we can work together across the industry. So similar to UNICA and your members, across all the procurement teams in Australia, we partner with 38 universities and share best practice together. So the structure of AUPN involves a modern slavery working group, which I'm part of, and that leads a lot of volunteers. These are procurement officers, sourcing specialists who come together to create a sector approach. There's also a dedicated modern slavery program manager with different work streams that we focus on. One of the benefits of working together is sharing best practice. So we collaborate with Australian and international experts, business and human rights specialists. We have an academic advisory board. So relating to what Esty said, tapping into the academic expertise of all these universities to come together to give best practice guidance. The other aspect that is particularly unique is our collaboration with the Cleaning Accountability Framework. This is a not-for-profit organisation that brings together workers, unions, cleaning suppliers, universities to address slavery in our cleaning supply chains. And that's particularly high risk because it is on our campuses, and also often cleaners work in outside normal hours, so irregular hours. And during COVID-19, this was a particularly high risk. And I think it's so important that we do engage and work with our workers and listen to their feedback in a way that they feel safe and comfortable. I think a lot of the modern slavery work that we're focusing on is around policies and processes, and that's really good, but we need to listen to the rights holders. We need to have that engagement. And through Cleaning Accountability Framework, we have an opportunity to create a new certification scheme for campuses. So there are currently 3 pilot universities completing this certification. And this will be then ready by 2025 to be launched across all universities. So what this certification includes will be undertaking audits on campus sites, checking pay slips, having independent meetings with workers and unions so they can share their feedback. And if there are any issues, that is actually collected and raised. So this is a really great example of collaboration across the university sector. And my final example is how we've been able to increase our leverage through our pilot of risk analysis implementation. So we're currently working with a tool called Freedom, which does predictive analytics around supply chain risks going beyond tier 1 supply chains, and 33 universities have signed up together on this. So as part of our pilot program, we identify where are our key strategic suppliers to bring them on this pilot program that covers lab and scientific equipment to ICT, telecommunications, stationery, cleaning, and grounds maintenance. And based on these high-risk categories, we leverage our strategic relationships depending on which universities had the best relationship with these suppliers so that they can use their influence and leverage to get them to sign up to this program, complete the supplier questionnaire, and also collect feedback. By using our aggregated buying power and our leverage, the suppliers were more willing to provide feedback and participate in the assessment. It also meant that we were reducing the burden or the fatigue of due diligence. A lot of suppliers are constantly asked to complete different questionnaires from different buyers, but by having one standardized questionnaire, we were able to have consistent data. And also for procurement colleagues and for suppliers, they only needed to fill out one questionnaire. And finally, it meant that we could have joint kind of memberships and discounts as a sector by being part of this Freedom tool. So my advice to you is to collaborate. I know a lot of universities tend to compete in the same market, but get out of that bubble and actually collaborate together, have some friendly competition. You know, as Essie mentioned, those rankings that we are currently at #1 is really helpful to push university to do the right thing as well. And with the EU supply chain due diligence law coming out, the legislation in Germany, for example, that started this year, there is a big focus in this space. So we can create enormous impacts through our roles as a university, but we can create even more impact working together. So I'll pass that on back to Esty. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil. And what an excellent segue into the next case study, which is so much about collaboration. I think I mentioned the risk to students, and the research that was done by this was actually done by another university, where it found that 77% of international students here in Australia were paid below the minimum wage. And in actual fact, the reason that the Australian government introduced a Modern Slavery Act is because of severe and systemic exploitation of students, particularly young international students that were working in sort of, you know, informal labour markets and were paid way, way, way below the minimum wage and were being exploited. So when we found out that this was a real risk that wasn't far away, far down the supply chain in tier X, but actually on our campus, and the very key stakeholders that we care so much about, our students, were potentially at risk of being exploited, we did the only thing we could possibly do, and that is reach out to civil society, where there is experience and expertise of dealing with lived experience, where rights holders, as Phil has just pointed out, is well understood. And we partner with Anti-Slavery Australia, Australia's largest anti-trafficking, anti-slavery not-for-profit. It's based out of another university, a competitive university, but that didn't matter because they had the expertise to help us develop a student-specific, world-first anti-slavery student module that we then rolled out to all our student cohorts. Now, I should point out that this module is voluntary completion. There's no mandatory requirement to do this. And since we launched it 2 years ago, I think that number now has gone up to 8,600, but 8,600 students have volunteered 15 minutes of their life to learn about what modern slavery is. And some of the commentary that's come out of that has been heart-wrenching to the extent of, you've just described my lived experience. I didn't realize that was illegal. We've also rolled out significant staff mandatory training. So over 13,000 of our staff have now completed this. But again, we developed this in partnership with Anti-Slavery Australia. And we've developed and delivered trauma-informed specific training to our student wellbeing teams. And this again is provided in partnership with Anti-Slavery Australia, which we just did one of these workshops on Friday. And now we have a student contact point on campus called the Safer Communities Office, where students can go and get help. But this was really critical because we couldn't have done this on our own. When we looked at the risk itself, it was extremely overwhelming. But when we reached out to collaborate with others and learn from others, it really became manageable. And I'm very proud that the University of Sydney was the first university in the world to introduce student training on this issue. And we hope that we can share, if we can share any of that material with you, if it's of use, we'd be more than happy to. But I think the key message for us here was collaboration was key and partnership was key. I mentioned quickly before the research-related risks, which are also very unique to the university sector. And this is particularly important because supply chain risks are really critical, but they're also better understood, largely because it affects thousands and thousands of corporations around the world, whereas research-related risks really are unique to research-intensive sectors like the higher education sector. And these are two really interesting examples that are based on real case studies, real cases that have come forward in the last 3 or so years, where obviously the issue around disposable gloves, now lab consumables that we use in our clinics, have been linked to forced labour, including forced labour in Malaysia, surgical instruments that we might be using in our clinical trials, in our faculties of medicine and health. 80% of those are produced in Pakistan, which has well documented cases of forced labour and child labour. And now that's still a supply chain risk. What's even more, I think, if you think about that being harrowing and particularly difficult to swallow, think about this. Think about research collaborations and research development and technologies that then are used to directly contribute to severe human rights violations, including arbitrary detention, genocide, forced sterilizations. Now, there was a case just not too long before we actually started out on this journey. The ABC Four Corners report identified a number of universities in Australia that had collaborated with a military sponsored agency to develop artificial technology, facial recognition, artificially enabled technology that would identify and track ethnic minorities. Now, that technology was then used to identify and incarcerate over 1 million Uyghur people in southwestern China. And this investigation has been able to identify that that particular research that was developed here in Australia contributed to those human rights violations. Now, the universities in Australia were not immune to that. Other universities around the US were also implicated in those types of human rights violations. And we know now, based on the latest report that's come out of the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, that there are significant human rights violations that are taking place in Xinjiang, and state-based actors are looking to research-based institutions to support with the technology needed to enable that level of surveillance and tracking. Now, that's a really big and significant issue for any university to tackle on its own. And like we were saying before, but together, I think as a sector, as a unit, we have a better chance at really moving the dial, but also identifying the best medium to how to address something like of this magnitude. A really quick note here, the international governments all around the world have adopted over 200 measures in response to the human rights violations in Xinjiang. And we're starting to see that very closely here in Australia, where it's very difficult for us to actually get funding from government at the Commonwealth level if we haven't undertaken the appropriate due diligence to demonstrate that we are not collaborating on critical technologies that are being used to commit human rights violations, that we are not collaborating with entities that have been sanctioned in the US or elsewhere for human rights violations. This is really starting to affect the way we operate, the way we receive funding. So going back to those strategic risks, the revenue risks, the reputation risks, this is a really clear-cut example of that, where we really need as a sector to come together and put our minds together to how we actually address this, not just because of the revenue impacts, but because it's actually causing significant human rights violations. And I don't think any university wants to be associated with that. In terms of what we've done to date, we have a very detailed compliance framework, and you can find it on our website. But what we've effectively done is launched a modern slavery policy where each principal officer at the University of Sydney has a responsibility to identify and address modern slavery risks. So those risks that I just mentioned within the research portfolio, our DVC research is responsible for those. So we work with her and her team to help identify those risks at each point of the research support pipeline. We also work with the faculties and schools, especially lead investigators and heads of school that have delegations of authority, to help them identify and prevent these sort of collaborations from even coming to the table, to say these are not aligned with our values. We do not want to be supporting these types of activities. It's not about saying no to the research, it's saying no to the partnership. We can find a better partner elsewhere that we know is aligned with our values. And this is an ongoing piece of work that's quite significant, and this will be a big focus for us for the next few years. Now, in terms of what we've done today, I think we've covered a little bit of this already, so I won't go through this in detail, but I will say that every single one of these things that we have achieved has been achieved in collaboration and in partnership. I cannot name one thing that we have done on our own. And I want to point that out because that is so critical to achieving anything when it comes to business and human rights, largely because it's impossible for any entity to understand and identify all the risks and the implications. I think at the beginning, I mapped every single entity that was linked to the university, and the university alone has thousands of joint ventures, let alone affiliates. So imagine the multitude of staff, units, entire offices of people that I would need in my office to be able to map all those risks. The only way we can identify and untangle this is by working together. Now, looking ahead, I've spoken a lot about risks, and there are, and Phil's already mentioned some of the legislative agenda that's emerging, and there is an emerging legislative landscape, especially in Europe, but also in Canada and the US, around business and human rights due diligence. And this is as of 2022. We also have, what you don't see behind this beautiful map, is that Joshua, our research assistant, has an Excel spreadsheet with every single clause, human rights due diligence clause in any country, in any jurisdiction. So let us know if you're interested in reading that. But it is extremely extensive. And what we're seeing is that as these stringent regulations come online, it is harder and harder for universities, corporations, and governments to operate without turning their minds to this. So this will just be a standard way of operating going forward. So being front-footed about it, understanding the implications is critical to being able to be responsive. Now, there are also really significant opportunities, and this is the part that we get most excited about and what keeps us going when we get down about all the bad things that we see in our day-to-day lives. And there is an immense opportunity to bridge this information education gap, developing new curriculum, establishing an international due diligence standard, establishing an international definition of modern slavery. You know, the list goes on and on. Connecting with academia, business, and civil society to develop technologies that we know are desperately needed, and universities are so well placed to provide this. I spoke a little bit about a modern slavery footprinting methodology with the University of Sydney is currently developing. That's really exciting technology that is not currently available in the market. For one university, I can't imagine all the amazing things that you're all working on that we could cross-purpose for this cause. Also supporting vulnerable demographics, being our students, and working out how we do that effectively. What's working for you? What's working for us? Can we share that? And of course, creating awareness amongst the general population. You will be surprised how many people still don't understand or don't know what modern slavery is. I've been working in this space in some form or another since 2008. And to this day, I still get asked, what is it that you do and what is modern slavery? So we have a very long way to go to educate our general population about what is okay. And just to give you a quick example here, you may all remember the Bangladesh Rana Plaza factory collapse that took place a number of years ago, where over 1,000 people died. Now, there were over 91% of garment consumers, so textile consumers who interviewed, said that they had no idea where their clothes were made, and they didn't care because they didn't realize that their clothes were actually made of forced labor. Now, talking about general population lack of awareness, I think we've got a long way to go before we have an engaged population. There's a couple of key takeaways here, but I think you can read these in your own time. But what I will say and what I will leave you with is that it's really, really important that you start wherever you are on this journey. And starting with supply chain is an excellent place to start. But please promise us that you won't stop there, because there are significant risks and opportunities elsewhere. Take a value chain approach, because that will really benefit you and your students, your suppliers, your partners, your collaborators, and really affect change by presenting human rights risks as a strategic risk to any entity, university or not. It is a strategic risk that really cannot be tolerated in a world where we have active stakeholders, global citizenship expectation that we all must meet. And again, the university sector alone has so much resource power and influence that it can really bridge the gaps that continue and remain in terms of information and understanding what these risks are. And on that note, we would love to hear from you if you want to collaborate with us to share tools, to develop templates, to share your lessons learned, strengthen the evidence base, or any other ideas you might have. Please reach out. We'd love to hear from you, because it's been a bit lonely in Sydney at times, and we're definitely looking to make more friends. So please reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much,